A notification came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening in early March. I had just gotten off a call with a client in Denver, a mid-size freight company that had been hemorrhaging money on last-mile delivery routes for years before hiring me to untangle the mess. It was the kind of work I loved, the kind where the answer was always hiding in plain sight inside the data, and I had finally cracked it. I was sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in Austin, still in the good feeling of having solved something real, when my phone buzzed face up on the counter. My brother's name was on the screen. Not a call. A text. "Mom and Dad decided it's best if you don't come to Grandma's 80th. It's a family thing, you understand." I read it twice, then a third time, the way you reread something hoping the words will rearrange into something less cruel. They didn't. A second message came before I'd put the phone down. "Honestly, you've always made things weird at these gatherings. Everyone will be more comfortable." Then a third, this one from my mother's number. "I know this is hard to hear, but it's what's best for the family. Grandma deserves a peaceful day." I set the phone face down on the table. The leftover half cup of coffee at my elbow had gone cold. Outside the window, the Austin evening was doing what it always did in March. Warm enough to fool you, with that particular slant of golden light that made everything look more forgiving than it was. I didn't feel forgiven. What I felt was something I recognized, something I had felt at 17 when they missed my National Merit Finalist ceremony because my brother had a soccer scrimmage, at 22 when they flew out for his college graduation but sent me a card for mine, at 26 when I told them I'd signed my first major consulting contract, and my mother said, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear your brother got promoted?" It was that specific exhaustion of being a person who exists at the edge of someone else's frame. My grandmother was turning 80. I had already bought her a first-edition copy of a Steinbeck novel she told me once was her favorite. I had already booked a flight. I replied to my brother with 2 words, "Okay, noted." Then I put the phone in my bedroom, sat back down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop to finish my client report. Not because I wasn't devastated, I was, but because I had learned a long time ago not to give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. My brother is 3 years older than me. His name is Ryan. Growing up, Ryan was the kind of kid that adults described as a natural, easy smile, good at sports, popular without trying. My parents loved him with a completeness that I noticed before I had language to describe it. They didn't love me less in the technical sense. There was food, there was shelter, there were school supplies and Christmas presents. But attention is its own currency, and in our house, Ryan held the mint. When Ryan got a C on a math test, my father sat with him at the dining room table for 2 hours and worked through every problem. When I got a C in gym class, I was bookish, uncoordinated, fundamentally not sporty. My mother told me I needed to try harder and moved on. When Ryan quit the baseball team his sophomore year, my parents worried for weeks about his confidence and took him to a sports psychologist. When I quit the debate team my junior year because the coach had a habit of publicly mocking students who stumbled, my father said, "You need to learn to have thicker skin. The real world is harder than this." I learned early that the love in our family had a shape, and the shape was Ryan. By the time I was in college, I'd stopped expecting anything different. I went to UT Austin on a partial scholarship, worked part-time at an accounting firm to cover the rest, graduated with a degree in supply chain analytics, and built something quietly while nobody was paying attention. My first job out of college paid $52,000 a year. 3 years later, I was consulting independently and clearing over 6 figures. At 29, I sold a proprietary route optimization model I developed to a logistics company in Atlanta for $1.1 million. I used part of that money to buy a house, a small craftsman bungalow 2 miles from downtown Austin that I renovated myself over 18 months, choosing every fixture and tile by hand. My family's response to all of this was largely unchanged. My mother told people I worked in computers. My father once introduced me at a family reunion as being in business or something. Ryan told his friends I was good with spreadsheets. The house got a slightly bigger reaction. Ryan called it baller in a tone that suggested he found it excessive. My mother asked how I could afford it. My father said nothing, which was its own answer. I named the house Heron, not out loud, not on any document, just in my head. It was something I did privately, the way I did most things that mattered to me. The name came from the great blue herons that nested in the greenbelt behind the backyard. I'd watch them in the early mornings from the kitchen window, standing impossibly still at the edge of the creek. They didn't ask permission to be there, they just were. The weeks after the text messages passed in the way weeks do, when something has quietly broken, but you're still going through the motions. I worked. I exercised. I saw my friend Camille for dinner and didn't mention it because I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, the way saying it would make it more real than it already was. My grandmother's 80th birthday came and went. I sent the book by express mail with a handwritten note inside the front cover. She called me 3 days later, her voice carrying that specific old phone quality that people over 70 have, and said, "I don't know why you weren't here, sweetheart, but I know it wasn't your choice. I can hear it." I told her it was complicated. She said she knew. What I didn't tell her was what I'd found in the meantime. 2 days after the texts, I'd received a certified letter from a bank I had no account with, addressed to me at my Austin address. The letter referenced a home equity line of credit in the amount of $340,000 attached to a property I had never heard of on a street in Pluggerville in my name with my social security number. I read it 4 times before I sat down on the floor. The lawyer I called was named Judith Okafor. She worked out of a small firm in downtown Austin that specialized in financial fraud and consumer protection, and she came recommended by a former client of mine who dealt with a business identity theft situation 2 years earlier. Judith was deliberate, unhurried, and had the particular quality of someone who had seen exactly this kind of thing before and understood precisely how serious it was. I brought her the certified letter. I brought her my credit reports, which I'd pulled immediately, all 3 bureaus. On 2 of them, there were accounts I had never opened. A credit card with a $15,000 limit that had been opened 11 months ago. A personal loan for $28,000 from a credit union in North Austin. The HELOC was the largest, but it wasn't the first. "Have you given anyone access to your personal information?" she asked. "Financial documents, your social security number, tax returns." I thought about it. My family has some of that. My mother used to help me file taxes when I was in college, before I started doing it myself. I don't know what she kept. Judith didn't react visibly, but something in her expression settled into a particular kind of careful attention. "Let me look into this," she said. "It may take a few weeks." Those few weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I filed a fraud alert with all 3 credit bureaus and froze my credit. I responded to the certified bank letter with a formal dispute letter Judith drafted, and I thought constantly about the timing. My family had sent those texts, the ones disinviting me from my grandmother's birthday, 2 days before the certified letter arrived. The letter had been sitting somewhere in transit while they were telling me not to come, not to be there, to stay out of the picture. That coincidence took root in my chest like a splinter. Judith called on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after our first meeting and told me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had a folder on her desk that looked heavier than it had any right to be. She walked me through it piece by piece. The credit card had been opened with my social security number, my date of birth, and an address that was neither my current address nor any address I'd ever had. It was a mailbox rental location in a strip mall in Round Rock, registered under a name I didn't recognize. The personal loan application had my income listed at approximately what I'd actually made 3 years ago, the year my taxes were likely still floating around in my parents' paper files. The HELOC was more complex. The property in Pluggerville was real, a duplex, purchased 14 months ago. The purchase had been partially financed through a conventional loan taken out in someone else's name, but the equity line, drawn against the property 6 months after purchase, had been taken out in mine. The signature on the equity line application was not mine. Judith had a forensic document examiner confirm it. I sat in the chair across from her desk and felt the room tilt in the way rooms do when you learn something that makes the last year of your life look different. "How did they get the property's equity tied to my name?" I asked. "Someone listed you as a co-borrower on the equity line application," she said, "and someone had enough of your personal information to make a convincing case to the lender. Your credit score at the time was high, over 780. That made you a useful person to attach to a loan." "And the mailbox in Round Rock," I said. "All correspondence related to the accounts went there." I asked her who had opened the mailbox. She told me it had been opened in the name of an LLC. The LLC had been formed in Delaware 10 months before the mailbox, with an agent of record that was a registered service, essentially untraceable without subpoenas. But she'd done some more digging, she told me. The phone number on the HELOC application, the one listed as the borrower's contact, was a prepaid number, long since disconnected. But the same number had been used as a reference contact on another document she'd found while pulling public records, a lease agreement on a storage unit in Pellergerville, signed by Ryan. I looked at her for a long moment. "My brother," I said. Judith said she couldn't draw legal conclusions yet, but she had more. The full picture took another 10 days to assemble, and it assembled itself the way bad news always does, in layers, each one worse than the one before. Ryan had purchased the duplex in Pflugerville through an LLC with a silent partner, a friend from his college days who had since moved to Scottsdale. The property had been purchased as a rental investment, and for the first several months it had actually generated income. Then the tenants left, the property sat vacant, and the maintenance costs started compounding. Ryan had already borrowed against his own credit to fund a renovation that went over budget. He was, by the time the equity line was opened, in serious financial trouble. He needed capital. He didn't have the credit to borrow more, but he knew someone who did. The equity line in my name had funded, as best Judith could trace, the renovation of the second unit and several months of carrying costs while he tried to find new tenants. He'd been making minimum payments on the line, just enough to avoid triggering delinquency notices, through the mailbox in Round Rock, using money that came and went through the LLC. 6 months ago, the LLC had effectively become insolvent. The payments had stopped. The bank had started sending notices to the Round Rock mailbox, and, eventually, to me. I read every document Judith had collected. I read the LLC formation papers. I read the lease agreement with Ryan's signature. I read the HELOC application with my name on it and a signature that someone had practiced well enough to fool a bank, but not well enough to fool a forensic examiner. Then I found the text. It was in a screenshot Judith had obtained through a subpoena that had gone to the phone carrier. The number associated with the HELOC application had been a prepaid phone, but it had been activated using a purchase made on a credit card, and that card had a billing statement tied to an email address, and that email address had, at some point, forwarded a message to a regular address Judith had been able to identify. It was a chain of digital forensics that had taken her firm's investigator 2 weeks to untangle, and at the end of it was a text message exchange between Ryan and our mother. My mother's message: "The notices are going to start coming to her eventually. We should get ahead of this." Ryan's response: "She won't do anything. She never does. She'll be too worried about making a scene." My mother again: "Make sure she's not at the party. I don't want her asking questions when everyone's together." I set the printed screenshot down on Judith's desk. I looked at the wall behind her for a moment. "That's why," I said. "Not a question." "It would appear so," she said carefully. "They hadn't disinvited me from my grandmother's birthday because I made things weird or because everyone would be more comfortable. They disinvited me because they were afraid of what happens when a family gathers and people start talking, and they didn't want me in the room when that happened." 29 years of feeling like an afterthought, and it turned out the last act of erasure wasn't even about me personally. It was just housekeeping. Keep the asset out of the room while you figure out what to do about the debt you ran up in her name. I made 2 calls the following morning. The first was to Judith, to formally authorize her to begin the process of disputing all fraudulent accounts and to engage with the bank directly regarding the HELOC. The second was to my own attorney, a separate one, a litigator named Patrick So, who had handled a contract dispute for me 2 years earlier. I trusted his directness. When I walked him through the evidence, he didn't hedge. "You have identity theft, fraud, and potentially wire fraud if the LLC was used to move money across state lines," he said. "You also have significant damages, impact to your credit, potential tax liability if those accounts generated reportable activity, attorney fees. The question is how far you want to take it." I already knew the answer. "All the way," I said. Patrick did not ask me if I was sure. He could tell. The formal dispute process moved quickly once Judith submitted the forensic documentation to the bank. Within 3 weeks, the HELOC had been flagged as fraudulent and my name removed from it. The credit card and personal loan followed within another month. My credit reports were corrected. The financial damage to me personally was, in the end, containable. partly because Judith had moved quickly, partly because the accounts had not yet gone fully delinquent. The damage to Ryan was a different matter. With the equity line stripped away, the duplex's financing structure collapsed. Ryan's silent partner in Scottsdale defaulted on his own obligations. The lender initiated foreclosure proceedings. Ryan, who had been personally guaranteeing portions of the renovation contractor's invoice, was sued by the contractor. His own credit took damage that would take years to recover from, and then Patrick filed the civil suit. Ryan called me on a Wednesday evening. I watched his name on the screen for 3 full rings before I answered. There was a pause on his end after I said hello, a hesitation I had never heard from him before. Ryan had always been the kind of person who moved through the world with a certainty that came from never having had to build it himself. "Why are you doing this?" he finally said. "This is going to destroy the family." I waited a moment before I responded. "You used my name," I said. "You used my credit. You forged my signature. You and Mom made sure I wasn't in the room when people might start asking questions. That's what destroyed something." "It was going to be fine," he said. "If the property had rented, we would have paid it off before you ever knew." "But it didn't," I said, "and now I do know. You're going to make us lose the house." Mom and Dad's house. I had thought about this. I had thought about it in the early mornings, sitting at the kitchen window watching the herons at the edge of the creek. I had turned it over and over, trying to find the angle at which it felt like my responsibility. I couldn't find that angle. "I didn't take out a loan in your name," I said. "I didn't forge your signature. I didn't send you a text message telling you not to come to a family gathering because I needed you out of the room. You made choices. Those choices have consequences. I can't carry them for you." He hung up without responding. My father called an hour later. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, stripped of the easy authority that had always made him sound like the final word on any subject. "Sweetheart," he said, and I almost laughed at that, the sudden tenderness after 30 years of comfortable indifference. "This has gotten out of hand. Your brother made mistakes. We all did. But we're a family. Can we sit down and talk about this?" "Talk to Patrick," I said. "Everything goes through him now." My mother texted that night. One word: unbelievable. I added it to the folder I'd started keeping on my phone. Screenshots, dated, organized for keeping on my phone. Screenshots, dated. My own version of a paper trail. My Aunt Rosalind reached out 2 weeks later. She was my father's younger sister, the one who had always lived slightly apart from the family's main gravitational pull. She'd moved to Portland years ago, married a woman named Diane, and maintained contact with the family through a particular kind of patient affection that didn't require approval. Her email was short. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry it took me this long to reach out. I've known for a long time that things weren't right. I should have said something sooner. Can we talk?" We video called the following Sunday. She sat in what looked like a study, bookshelves behind her, a cup of tea on the desk, and she told me things I had suspected but never had confirmed. She told me that at family gatherings over the years, she had heard Ryan describe my consulting work as basically just freelancing. Anyone could do it, and watched my parents nod along. She had heard my mother tell people that I had been a difficult child, too independent, never let you in, as though my self-sufficiency were a defect I had willfully chosen. She pulled up an email, printed and scanned. It was from my mother to her, from 8 months ago. "Ryan is in some financial trouble," my mother had written. "He needs to find a way through it quietly. The last thing we need is for Meredith to find out and make it all about herself." I looked at my name in that sentence for a long time. "She wrote that 8 months ago," I said. "Yes," my aunt said quietly. They'd already started planning. They had known about Ryan's situation for nearly a year. They had made a decision, not out of desperation, not in a moment of panic, but deliberately, over months, that the cleanest solution was to use me as a financial backstop without my knowledge. And they had managed my access to family events, to information, to the ordinary intimacy of a family gathering in order to protect that plan. I thought about all the times I had assumed my distance from the family was something I'd created, some failure of effort on my part, some deficiency in warmth or softness that had pushed them away. I'd spent years trying to diagnose what was wrong with me, what I could do differently, what version of myself they might finally recognize. Sitting in my kitchen in Austin with the creek visible through the window and a printed email on my screen, I understood something clearly for the first time. The distance had never been mine to close. They had maintained it carefully, deliberately, because a daughter who was too present was a daughter who might ask questions. I met them at a conference room in Patrick's office on a Thursday in early May. They arrived together, Ryan, my mother, my father. Ryan looked like he hadn't slept well in a month. My mother had the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed her expression. My father sat down and looked at the table. Patrick sat beside me. A court reporter sat in the corner. I had insisted on it. I laid out the documents in front of them. The forensic handwriting analysis, the digital trail Judith's firm had assembled, the text exchange between Ryan and my mother, the email my mother had written to Aunt Rosalind. I laid them out one at a time, methodically, and watched their faces move through a set of emotions that landed eventually in a kind of resignation. "You used my name," I said, when the documents were all on the table. "You used my credit, my social security number, my financial history. You built something on a foundation that was mine without asking, without telling me. And when it started to crack, you made sure I was far enough away that I wouldn't notice." My mother started to say something about intentions, about difficulty, about how hard the last 2 years had been. "I'm sure they have been," I said, "but hard doesn't mean I owe you anything. I don't owe you my credit score. I don't owe you my silence. I don't owe you a version of myself that stays small and unquestioning so that your plan keeps working." Ryan looked up then. "You've always acted like you were better than us." I looked at him for a moment. "No," I said, "I acted like I was a person. You kept requiring me to act like furniture. There's a difference." My father, who had not spoken yet, cleared his throat. "We're facing real consequences here. Your mother and I could lose our home." I had expected to feel something when he said that. Guilt, softening, the old pull of wanting to be the person who fixed things so everyone could be comfortable again. I waited for it. It didn't come. "I know," I said. "I didn't cause those consequences. You did when you made these decisions. I can't undo them for you, and I'm not going to try." Patrick closed the folder on his side of the table. "My client has no interest in pursuing a settlement that involves her absorbing any portion of the financial liability created by these accounts. If you'd like to discuss the civil complaint, we can do that through counsel." My mother looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something past composed, something that was simply tired. "I don't know how you can do this," she said. I thought about my grandmother, turning 80 without me in the room. I thought about Ryan on the phone saying she won't do anything, she never does. I thought about the morning I'd read his texts and set my phone face down on the kitchen table and gone back to my work, because I had learned so early to absorb and continue. "I learned it from you," I said. "You taught me to handle things quietly, without making a scene. I'm handling this." I stood. Patrick stood. The court reporter began packing up her equipment. At the door, I stopped. There was something I had been carrying around for weeks that I hadn't said out loud yet, and I found I wanted to say it. Just once, clearly, before I closed this chapter. "I spent a long time trying to understand what I did wrong," I said without turning around. "What made me not worth the same attention, the same assumption of good faith. I thought it was something in me. I know now it wasn't. You saw me as a resource. I'm not going to apologize for refusing to be one." I walked out into the May morning, and the air was already warm, and somewhere across the city a freight company was waiting on revised route optimization data that I had promised them by Friday. The civil suit settled 8 months later. Ryan's attorney negotiated terms that included his acknowledgement of the identity theft, restitution for legal fees I had incurred, and a formal agreement that he would cooperate with the credit bureaus in resolving any remaining reporting issues. The criminal referral, which Patrick and Judith had made jointly to the district attorney's office, was still pending at the time of the settlement, though I was told by the DA's victim advocate that the evidence was strong. My parents sold their house in the fall, not because of me directly, but because the financial domino effect of Ryan's collapse left them without the income stream they had been relying on, and their mortgage became unsustainable. They moved into a rental in a suburb south of Austin, smaller and quieter than the house I'd grown up in. I drove past the old house once on my way to a client meeting. Autumn had come early that year, and the oak tree in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves already. The for rent sign in the window was a simple white rectangle. I didn't slow down. My grandmother called me in December, 2 months after the settlement. She was living in assisted living in San Antonio by then, and she called from her landline, and I could hear the television on in the background, the way I always could when she called from that place. "I need to tell you something," she said. She told me that on her birthday, the evening of the party I hadn't attended, she had gone looking for me. She had asked Ryan where I was, and he had told her I'd had a prior commitment. She said she had known immediately that wasn't true. She said she had taken the book I sent her, the Steinbeck, and put it on her nightstand, and it was still there. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am not a woman who approves of what happened, whatever anyone tells you." I told her I knew. She told me she loved me. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Her physical therapy, a documentary she'd watched about coral reefs, a recipe she was trying to get her aide to make for her. An hour that had nothing to do with any of it, just two people talking. When I hung up, I sat for a moment in my kitchen with the winter light coming in low and pale through the window. The creek was quieter in December. The herons were still there. In January, I got an email from a woman named Isabel, a logistics consultant in Chicago, who had read about my route optimization methodology in a trade publication and wanted to talk about collaborating on a project. We met over video call, and she was sharp and organized and had been doing the same kind of work for 11 years, from a position of near total invisibility in a firm that treated her ideas as belonging to the company rather than to her. We talked for 2 hours, and at the end she said, "Do you ever think about whether people like us should be doing this together instead of alone?" I had been thinking about exactly that. We started meeting weekly. By March, we had a framework for a consulting partnership that would pool our methodologies and our client networks and operate as a co-owned entity. I handled the financial structure. She handled the operational side. We were careful and deliberate, and we put everything in writing, every agreement, every expectation, documented and signed. I named my portion of the business Heron Analytics. She liked the name. She didn't need to know where it came from, though I think she understood it had come from somewhere personal. The work was good. The work was mine. Some mornings I still sit at the kitchen window with the first cup of coffee and watch the herons at the edge of the creek before the rest of the day starts. They haven't changed. They stand at the water's edge with that particular stillness that isn't patience, exactly. It's more like the absence of any need to prove their right to be there. I think about that a lot. The absence of that need. How long it took me to find it. How I built it the same way I built everything else. Not because anyone handed it to me or made space for it, but because I kept working, quietly, at the edges of other people's certainty, until I had enough of my own. My brother's case is still working through the system. I don't check on it often. I have other things to check on. The Steinbeck is still on my grandmother's nightstand. She told me so last time we talked. That's enough. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was the text message. The casual cruelty of it. You make things weird. Everyone will be more comfortable. As if I were a weather pattern to be managed rather than a person to be considered. I carried that for a while. I won't pretend I didn't. But looking back now, the hardest part wasn't the rejection. It was the realization that came after, that the rejection had been a tool, not a feeling. Ryan and my mother didn't send those messages because they were hurt or frustrated or even honestly tired of me. They sent them because they needed me out of the room. There's something almost clarifying about that, once you can see it clearly. It means the problem was never me. What I've come to understand about the way this all unfolded is that every action had a weight that eventually had to be carried by someone. Ryan made choices, to use my name, to forge my signature, to build something on a foundation he didn't own. And for a while, he managed to distribute that weight so that it wouldn't land on him. That's what the mailbox in Round Rock was for. That's what the text messages were for. Keep the asset out of the room, keep the asset quiet, and the weight stays suspended indefinitely. But weight doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And the moment I pulled my name off those accounts, every ounce of it came back to rest exactly where it had originated. I didn't punish him. I just stopped absorbing the consequences of his decisions. The difference matters to me. I think about the version of myself that Ryan and my mother had counted on, the one who wouldn't make a scene, who would quietly accept whatever was put in front of her because the alternative was conflict, and she had learned to fear conflict more than harm. That version of me had been cultivated carefully over 30 years. She was the product of every time I was told I was too sensitive, too independent, too much. She was useful to them precisely because she was trained to make herself small. What they didn't account for was that the same qualities they dismissed as defects, the self-sufficiency, the habit of working through problems alone, the comfort with data and documentation, were exactly the qualities that allowed me to dismantle what they'd built. The thing they thought made me manageable made me dangerous once I decided to stop managing myself on their behalf. I don't say that with any particular triumph. What I feel now is closer to something quieter. I rebuilt my credit. I built a business partnership with someone who values what I bring to the table. I talk to my grandmother every few weeks, and she tells me about her physical therapy and the documentaries she watches, and neither of us mentions the birthday party because we don't need to. The herons are still at the creek behind my house most mornings. They were there before any of this happened, and they'll be there long after. There's something instructive in that, in the way they simply occupy the space they've chosen without apology, without audition. They don't ask the creek for permission to stand at its edge. I spent a long time asking for permission I never needed. I'm done with that now.